without further delay, let's bring on today's guests. Hi, Gerald. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, James, my Irish brother. It's so good to be back having a real dialogue with some real meat.
That it is, Gerald. This is a real dialogue, and we've done some pretty heavy-hitting shows, and I'm just glad that it's continuing. I even had a couple of discussions during the week with the show we do, and I don't normally get to do that, Gerald. And I had a couple of private dialogues with the show, and the response that I'm getting, and the information that we're talking about is just super fascinating because it's very current, it's very pertinent to where I want to go in life, what I want to explore. And a lot of people are into this, Gerald, because they don't just want to know about the history. They want to know what it means for them. They want to know what they can do with it. I mean, if we were genetically altered as a slave species, was that a good thing? Was that a bad thing? If that was the case, Gerald, well then, where does that leave us today? Are we going to evolve, or were we permanently just, made with defects? And all these questions are abound now, Gerald. All these questions are abound, and that's what we're getting into, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that process you're describing where someone finds out the truth about their origins, and there's a deconstruction process that kind of goes along with that they have to start from the past, corroborate, and then they start fast forwarding to their lives and how it affects them here and now. And it usually takes some time, but and it's a process I've watched since I've been in this realm for several years now. I started researching this stuff in 2003 or 2004, and I was one of those kind of sideline observers, even though I was staying fully engaged in my research, but I couldn't really talk about the stuff and still continue the lifestyle that I was in, especially as an engineer. Mm-hmm. So, it was still goofy information where people didn't even talk about UFOs that much. It had started though. And then, in 2009 with the Ancient Aliens on History Channel coming out and starting to broach some of this material, it started becoming a little more discussable. So
sure, it's a journey of discovery.
In general, this process that somebody goes through when they're exposed to this, and some people have assigned, labels to what they call it, and it it's kind of telling, and some people call it breaking the God spell in a way because of what was done. So
it's a profound journey of discovery, Gerald, and you see it in people when they get the knowledge and they can't deny it anymore, and then they go, and the awareness comes after that and what it all means. It is a profound journey of discovery. I guess that's what leads us into the topics for today's show. I mean, last time we got into the Gigi, the miners, the awareness. Did they have awareness? Did they get triggered with mechanisms for ascension, or Ningishida, the geneticist, to fix the problem? These are all great questions and great explorations of the details of the legacy of what we've been left with this information. Let's get right into it, Gerald. Let's continue on that. What is the composition of man? What are we made of today? Where are we coming from? What do we know about ourselves from this history of the Anunnaki and the legacy that's been left to us?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because this chapter that we're discussing, chapter 3 out of my new book, The Seventh Planet, is really a synthesis of my pragmatic experience, mm-hmm. where science hasn't really caught up with some of the exploratory realms, and people who are playing with higher energy through auric fields, through meditations, things like that, mm-hmm. versus, what we could measure. So I think both of those come out in this chapter, which is kind of the best we can do with where we're at least where I was at the time that I had this information. So when we talk about the composition of man, that's probably a topic that I started thinking about when I was 13 or 14, and I was in sports, right? So I was playing football, running track, and playing baseball, pretty typical sports. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that, in competing on the field, that there were certain athletes that were more inspired, more capable, more whatever than others, and they were the stars, right? And so being any typical kid is like, well, it's like looking at an animal that has a capability that you don't have. Go, well, what do I have to do to be able to operate that way? So I started looking at people on the chessboard of life more in terms of these entities that had certain energy, and usually where there was this bigger than life energy, there was a being who had, yes, a big ego, but oftentimes just an auric field that was overwhelming. They'd light up a room they walk in. And then I started thinking to myself about this: what is the place where energy and matter intersect, and how do we characterize this? And you know, it was a question I was asking myself as a young athlete, and I never really quite got an answer, but that was still in the background of my mind when I was thinking about the composition of man.
Mm-hmm.
And this came to a head for me, this distinction between energy and matter, when I was just graduating from my structural integration training in Kauai that was taught by the Guild for Structural Integration based out of Boulder. And so I was doing the final 2 phases of my holistic healthcare practice training to become a structural integrator for my kid JJ, really
Mm-hmm.
not to open a practice, but I just wanted this knowledge that we discussed previously.
Sure.
Anyway, so in this process, I was sitting in my room looking out over a lagoon in Kauai, and it was a really deeply spiritual setting on the property where the kahunas used to go to receive their healing, in terms of the energy from the acoustics of how the hills shaped the sound of the ocean coming in, to the waterfalls that were endemic on this 27-acre property. Okay, I mean, it was amazing, and you could actually see from Kahuna Springs, you could see Makaleha, one of the high peaks where there were 4 waterfalls coming down while you're in a classroom setting on this property. It was absolutely stellar place to learn about the human energy. Anyway, so I'm sitting here looking out over this lagoon, surrounded by bamboo and frogs chirping and all these frequency interactions going on. And I'm thinking to myself, and I got to write a graduation paper for this class, right? And it's coming up. So I'm asking myself, and the reason I'm asking myself about the composition of man and the difference between energy and matter at a really heavy introspective level at this point in my path, was because something was changing in my body, and I was experiencing different sensations that were foreign to me, that I could not explain scientifically. And so because of this structural integration process where I'd gone, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, to learn this practice, I had been exposed to quite a bit of the work in a very short period of time. For those who know about structure work, when you first start Rolfing, I had 10 series in a very short period of time, probably within a year and a half. And that's a lot of structural stirring up in a short period of time. Well, while I'm in this state and I'm about to graduate this course, I'm staring out thinking, how am I going to discuss human energy? Because that's what I want to talk about as an electrical engineer. That's what was on my mind, you know, in writing this paper. And there weren't many guidelines that limited your ability to choose whatever topic you wanted, which was really nice. So, and of course I wanted to relate it to what I'd just been through this course, so I chose a topic called Structure, Its Function, and Energy to try to explain where energy meets matter, and with the best understanding, scientific and pragmatic, that I had at the time. And the real thing I was focused on mostly in explaining was not so much the human energy body itself, even though I detailed it in the paper. I was really focused on truly trying to understand what gravity was at that time. Because I realized that gravity was such a significant force. We encounter it every day. Nobody really pays attention to it that much, except for trying to avert things from falling from one height to a lower height and breaking glasses. You know, they're not really paying attention to how it's affecting their bodies. Well, structural integration was all about that. And one of the hidden magical pieces of this was all of a sudden I was having an experience that was different energetically in my body, my temple, such that when I was exposed to sunlight or water or various stimuli, I was having just a profound experience, you know, which I had not had before, just, you know, a short time ago. So I'm like, what's different? What's going on? And I was feeling some really amazing sensations to try to explain. So ultimately, and my quest was to understand where energy meets matter and what that place is. And clearly it's in our body for us, okay? The most important real estate on the planet is your body. It's your interface to the infinite. So from that standpoint, when we start talking about the composition of man, first of all, you got to start from energy. and describe what this is that animates one sports player on the chess game to have more energy, more capabilities, more whatever than another one, you know. And a lot of it comes from when you're young like that and you don't have the mental constructs to put together, you know, a way of thinking. You haven't been trained, you know, to visualize your performance like Olympic athletes are. I mean, it's just natural. It was just natural, raw talent / you know, structure all together that would produce whatever landed on an elementary or junior high school football field, right?
Sure.
So I was thinking deeply about where energy meets matter, and so I ended up, it's a bullet point later on in our discussion where I talk about the human energy equation. So we'll get to that when we get there. But so this composition of man. So what are we, and what models do we have to represent ourselves? Now, I didn't share this one with you, but while we're on the idea of structure work, there are lines and planes in the body that basically, if they're understood and how they relate to the vertical field of gravity, we come up with a pretty simple way to measure a human relative to this field and go, well, you know, is man this material form that's being beaten down by this force and ends up, you know, all his structural components going wide and so one thing I want to bring up is in the composition of man, there's something very malleable about the human form. And I'll give you some examples. Number one, think about a woman who has a baby. She starts out, you know, with a normal abdominal section, and all of a sudden it can grow to the size of a basketball.
Sure.
And then produce a baby, which stretches various organs to allow this to occur. And then, you know, with some minor side effects, the body goes back to the way it was before this huge change happened in a 9-month period. Now, the other extreme is people who gain a lot of weight, you know, and then lose a lot of weight. You can see that the body can be made various forms. Then there's the extreme muscle building community that's doing you know, bodybuilding.
Oh yeah.
So the idea of transforming this matter we call man or woman into its various I don't know, forms that it can take on has quite a range, quite a broad range.
Sure.
Okay. Well, one of the key elements of that is there's malleability there.
Interesting
in
outlook,
our
Gerald.
structure, in our tissue. So what is that? Well, structure work went into this very deeply, and I wasn't so concerned about the anatomy and physiology as I was figuring out what they knew that I could learn and do this and help my kid who had really bad issues with his connective tissue. And this is how I started. So let's talk about the structure of the body from that standpoint, and I'll give you some neat models that we used in addition to the ones that came from the Emerald Tablets, from Drunvalo, and other sources, okay? But this one was pragmatic for me, and I tried this hat on, and it truly fits, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So what do we know about the composition of man relative to the structural integration model? Well, from that standpoint, gravity is everything. And so this strong force field that shows up in my equation 5 is the figure of merit to align to. Okay, let's just start with that. So the whole concept is to take the body and align it to this infinite force field we call gravity. Well, how is that done? You just posture, stand up straight, and push your shoulders back, and you're good to go? Not hardly. The reality is by the time you're 6 years old, with no knowledge of how to integrate with the gravity field because you were never taught, you can't sit up straight, and your structure is already so deviated that without intervention with structural integration, you will grow into that pattern, and it's going to be with you for life. That's the reality. And that's so when we're talking about the composition of man, this hidden knowledge about how the body works was abominable to me once I realized that there's true freedom in the body if you just know how it works. Mm-hmm. Okay, and a lot of it has to do with this concept of gravity in the structural integration domain, referencing gravity as the therapist. Well, that's kind of a great deference to some infinite force, but the reality is, if you think about that from a scientific standpoint, what is this field of gravity doing with your energy body? And that's why I ended up with my equation in the first book, where I derived it for people, and then the second book, I showed it and then described it in natural language so that there wasn't, you know, lambda, nu, and all these Greek symbols for people that were turned off by that kind of math. And it was pretty simple math. But anyway.
I think that's what differentiates you, Gerald, from other Anunnaki authors and I know you've evolved into the second book to bring this into human terms and what it means for us as well. But like I say, some people just focus on the genetics of the Anunnaki and that they engineered this, and they don't go into the depth of it. They just mention it, they regurgitate it. But Gerald, you do something different. You talk about this in terms of human energy, frequencies, consciousness, and the chakras, and you apply your electrical engineering background to talk about wavelengths, and we touched a little bit on that last time, but it's a wonderful, well-rounded, insightful perspective, Gerald.
Well, it is a kind of goofy perspective that I ended up with, and that I was brave enough to not worry about someone judging me and try things that I couldn't explain scientifically. So I broke the scientific method in exploring alternative human energy and consciousness and all these areas that were of interest to me, you know, in my truth-seeking path, while at the same time I could back up, put on my scientific hat, scrutinize what I had done, and try to explain it in terms scientifically that the world would accept, because everybody's so left-brained. They haven't caught up with this ancient knowledge of what we used to know about our body. So there was one other thing, a special thing I wanted to throw in about structure work. I launched into learning these techniques, being exposed to it during a triathlon, which I think I told the story before, in order to find a way to deal with what was happening in my kid, JJ. And he was in braces. He was about 5 years old, and he was having trouble walking. Well, there was some genetic side effect from his syndrome caused his connective tissue to droop on his body. It was very loose. So much so it looked like he had big socks on around his ankles where it drifted down and was covering his feet. And his ankles were almost indistinguishable at the talocrural joint, right where his ankle was. So I'm like, what's going on with it, with this? And that's when I discovered that Ida Rolf had been probing into, the founder of structural integration. She'd been probing into this same issue of malleability of tissue for her kid who had polio. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. I got the same kind of issue with my kid, because if whatever's going on with his connective tissue, if that wasn't happening, we wouldn't have these braces that go in underneath his shoes and all this crap, making him walk like a robot. It looked ridiculous. And it was really not comfortable for him. And with a special needs child that can't communicate with you verbally, you always ask yourself, are they in pain? Are they comfortable? And watching for the somatic signals from them. So you end up with a very somatic relationship with a child. So the idea that structure work was such a somatic connection to a being through their energy body and a hands-on methodology and all that is really very, very a profound relationship with a client in the first place. So let's go back to what I found out about special needs children and in general for all people relative to the composition of man and this primitive knowledge. What I discovered in my practice that lasted well over 10 years, that JJ, my son, launched me into, I discovered that there's a primitive intelligence in all beings. And that primitive intelligence, once accessed, awoken, stirred, and I can explain how that's done through structure work, has the ability, like a radio receiver, to tune in the gravity field and readjust the stacked segments of the human body and relate them to gravity such that you're not in pain. Okay, most people, 95% of people have back problems. And you have to ask yourself, did our creator make a mistake in composing our structure such that we can't integrate with gravity? Because it's a big problem. Because when you see that it's one of the variables in composing your human energy body in equation 5A in my book, you realize, hey, I can't ignore gravity. How does it affect me? And then here's a model I want to give you. So if we know that gravity operates vertically relative to the surface of the Earth all the way down to the core, it's represented as an orthogonal right angle vector, if you're standing there. So now let's think about that. If we take a broom pole that's long enough and you put it on your index finger and stand it up vertically, you realize that with little effort, once you've been practiced it a few times, you can balance that long pole on your finger with just little tiny, I don't know, almost like circadian movements of your hand with very little effort. Okay, but as soon as that pole starts falling over a little bit and you lose control of it, gravity's got control of it, and now it's going to fall, right? Well, in that same model, imagine your body is that broom pole, okay, and you're standing vertically in the gravity field, negating the excessive efforts that you need in your body to counteract this force in order to stabilize yourself in it, versus balancing like a pole in it, and now something magical happens at that place. And this is what Ida Rolf discovered, okay? That place where you find this vertical line and integrate your finite matter with this infinite force is one of the most profound experiences a human will ever have. And the fact that that ability to find that vertical line exists even in special needs children that are severely mentally retarded warmed my heart and made me realize whoever created us did a very special thing for us. And the fact that that has been hidden from man, and that only a few small percentage of people and seekers, usually athletes and people that are in yoga and things like that, discover structural integration. Only those people know this, and they know it pragmatically. I think I was one of the first people to take that pragmatic process that was happening and put that to an equation. Okay, so
how big a role does yoga?
Very, very.
How big a role does yoga play with this posture and this exploration of the gravity field on the body?
Well, it's funny you bring that up. I was thinking about that today. So in the East, yoga is done as a lifestyle. They know that about these energy fields. They're trying to improve the energy in their chakras by learning to balance and all these other things that they do relating to the gravity field. Okay, they don't realize that these asanas, truly, if you think about it from an energy standpoint, get them to the place where they can sit in a posture, sits bones engaged on the ground, lumbars not hurting, head stacked on top, and they can sit in a meditative state all day. Well, how many people do you know that can sit in a position like that on the floor without being, oh, my back hurts, or something goes wrong within 10 minutes, okay? Mm-hmm. That's the reality. So in yoga in the West, and I participated in this as well, and the reason I started yoga, I have to tell you the story. Once I'd had my first Structural Integration 10 series, my body started changing. And I ended up seeking out a more organized way to stretch, and I naturally found yoga because they had a book with some pictures, do this stretch, this was, and as a athlete a priori, I'd spent over 17 years in the gym. I was a really hardcore gym rat. I mean hardcore.
Sure.
Actually, I don't know where that energy came from in me, but I would spend hours back and bis, chest and tris, legs, cardio. I mean, and I was in such good shape when I was in the military that they made me the master fitness trainer, and that just gave me another excuse to be in there even more. So I really liked the transformative ability to do something to your body, break it down, it recovers, and then gets stronger. I thought that was a neat thing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway. Let's see. So back to the composition of man. There's another model I want to give you that I discovered in this path as well that really helped me understand how to relate to gravity better. And I know we're spending a lot of time on this, but this,
it's important.
And Kristen, I agree. This area of knowledge about the handbook of how you operate in the simulator, sitting, standing, walking, understanding what gravity is and how to have it help you, not beat you down. Okay, there's a war always with gravity, and if you don't understand it, it always wins. Go look at anybody's posture at their C7 that's unaware of gravity after 50 years on this planet, and I guarantee you gravity won. Kyphotic humps, all kinds of deviations, subluxations, rotated vertebra, all that happens because the connective tissue gets hard with aging. It's a natural thing. So in yoga, there's 4 things that change the connective tissue. I'm just going to lay it out there right now, okay, for people that don't know. And they can be done in combination so that there's a more amplified effect. Number 1, there's pressure. Number 2 is tension. Number 3 is temperature. And number 4 is frequency. Okay? So in structural integration, they generally use 3 of the 4. Usually they make sure the body is at a good temperature such that the fascia, the connective tissue, is warm. Why? Because it's more malleable then. Ask anybody who lives in Detroit versus somebody who lives in Tucson how their body feels in the winter. Right? When you're in a warm environment, your connective tissue is more malleable. Pressure can be used to change the state of material. Now think about collagen. It's basically protein strands put together in various forms. When you need a ligament, they're woven together like a rope. When you need something that's cartilaginous that can be mobile without breaking, you create something like a nose or an ear. Okay, but it's all made from the same material. Okay, this connective tissue is analogous to slicing open an orange. Inside an orange, you have the meat of the orange, but it's surrounded by the white material that gives those sacs its structure. Well, your connective tissue in your body is exactly the same as that. It gives your body its form and its structure. So here's a model I want to share with people relative to that. And a good friend of mine in Hawaii actually built one of these out of popsicle sticks and rubber bands. It was a funny model we used to call a human, and it's analogous to a suspension bridge, and it's called the tensegrity model.
Mm-hmm.
So in that model, imagine you replaced all the bones in the body with sticks, and all the muscles and connective tissues with rubber bands. Okay. So now all of a sudden, if you did that, you'd realize that there are suspension points on the body, much like like the Golden Gate Bridge, where you have high points that have attachments that allow the body to stand in the gravity field if it's properly free enough to do so. So in this tensegrity model, this 3D model, you can imagine rubber bands and popsicle sticks at birth. You come out of the womb in having been in a kind of a folded up position, and now all of a sudden your structure's got to experience the simulator and unwind and adapt to this gravity field. This is an SI model. Okay, so in that case, we know that for some reason, and nobody really knows why, it might be a design flaw, the connective tissue in humans is able to attach and to itself, to bones, to everything else, and it's very deviated at birth. Your rubber bands are glued at places at birth along those popsicle sticks, and they're not symmetrical bilaterally along your mid-sagittal plane or horizontally from the pelvis up or down. Okay, so basically, Ida Rolf, and it's not meant to be a derogatory term, she referred to anybody who has not had structure work as a random body, and she's absolutely right. And I've had my hands on hundreds and hundreds of clients and gone through this process with them, and I can assure you, her research and her work is correct. Okay, and I've seen it, so I have lots of corroborating data. So what I want you to think about when we're talking about this composition of man, this one to me really ought to be illuminated, and I harp on this on the books, all the books in the research. Get some structure work. Get your antenna right if you want to experience a higher dimension of consciousness. Okay, and a lot of people want to know that because they realize that the more aware you are, and power, information is power. You can only be aware of what you're conscious of, and the higher consciousness you have, we talked about last time, the more scope of accessibility you have to address these kind of things. And and the same is true with all these things that are happening in the realm of this new great year. That a lot of people are waking up to new things that they never even thought about 10 years ago. Lots of things.
Sure. I know we talked a lot on the physical body there, Gerald, and last show we talked about awareness and how that may be enhanced through ascension, and we may have evolved in the last 5,000 years. We may have been triggered. So just tie this all together with the physical, the astral, and the mental, Gerald.
Yeah.
Let's
so
try
in
the
chapter
three aspects.
From the Emerald Tablets, Thoth gives us a model as he's talking about the composition of man, which I thought was a good title to start bringing in both the pragmatic and the different models that various practices have. The Hindus have the chakra model and so on and so forth. So in the book, I talk about these three aspects that come from Thoth in his Emerald Tablets. And he talks about having a threefold composition, which is a subset of 9 total elements, as above, so below. These are physical, astral, and mental. Mm-hmm. So in the physical, he talks about magnetism traveling through nerve ganglia and pathways to provide this energy for cells and tissues. So the idea of magnetism is so important, and I never really thought about how important that was. Think about recording media, like the old 8-track tapes, and everything used to use magnetism and a head that was underneath there, and it rubbed this tape across there that had a ferromagnetic field on it that could be changed by the electrical stimulus along this little head, Mm-hmm. So, and then it got to the place where we realized that energy could be captured in flash devices using an understanding of how energy is interacting with material forms. Lock a 1 or a 0 into a little tiny cell, right? So then I started thinking about, well, this magnetism relative to birds that migrate and marine mammals that are whales and dolphins that are sensitive to the magnetic field, which actually is quite subtle. If you pull a compass out, you'll see, this is not a real strong field. It's just enough to get a little, and you got to have the needle really small and balanced for it to actually respond to this field, right? Well, so that sensitivity in that compass has to be at least as sensitive in a bird or a dolphin or a whale that's navigating using magnetism. So the idea of magnetism and its effect on memory is an area that Drunvalo touches on in his book. Imagine the magnetic field of the Earth suddenly disappeared. What would happen to human memory? Is there some relationship there? And according to Thoth, there is some relationship where he's talking about magnetism operating through the nerve ganglia. Okay, these are your chakras. So that's pretty profound. He mentions one other field that I found interesting. In my human antenna model, and I had derived my human antenna model in the structures, function, and energy paper back in 2004 when I wrote it. And I think I don't know if I had read the Emerald Tablets by that point in my life. I don't think I had, actually.
Sure.
Very shortly thereafter, I did go to a conference on sacred geometry where I had read the Emerald Tablets, but it was after I did Drunvalo's Flower of Life, Volume 1 and Volume 2 book, and then the workshop, okay? So anyway, this idea that Thoth introduces us to is this other subtle energy field that flows through the skeletal structure, and he calls it the Akasa field. So now imagine your ribs are kind of like antennas, and they're receiving some energy and possibly getting to your central conductor along your your spinal cord, okay? Which actually, from the chakra tradition, they call the Sushumna. You have the Ida Pingala, or the Ida Nadi and the Pingala Nadi. So these are the energy pathways up and down, in parallel with your central spine, your conductor. And that central spine conductor is the one that shows up in the Caduceus that I know we're going to talk about. Okay, so
the mag tape that you were referring to, Gerald? Just on a point worth noting, it used to be, I don't know where you'd get a copy of mag tape now to do this test, but it used to be if you had a brand new tape and you pressed record, let's say you went into a house on your own in the middle of nowhere, you could pick up voices being recorded on that, echoes and voices.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess a lot of these ghost chasers and stuff take highly sensitive instruments.
That's why they had magnetic tape,
pick up magnetic anomalies. Listen, submarines do it too. They send out signals to detect magnetic anomalies to see if some large metal opposing force is out there, pretending to be a whale. And actually they can do this from space now, from what I understand. Pick up magnetic anomalies. They analyze the changing magnetic flux of the Earth from space, and you can actually see that the magnetic field on the Earth is changing locations, which is quite interesting. As a pilot, we used to have to take your compass and go, and you'd have the declination on the map that you needed to program as an offset into your compass, so that it would take into account where you were relative to the north. Okay, and each it was adjustable. So now all of a sudden you see them renumbering runways because it's changed so much. That's crazy, because all these aircraft, if they don't have, if they only have primitive navigation, it's probably an old compass in there that's in some sort of stabilizing fluid. So if the gravity field's moving around, it can really throw visual flight navigation into a tailspin. And that reminds me of what happened to Admiral Byrd. That happened to him.
Sure. I had a conversation today, which is ironic because I was talking about astrology and it's the effect of electromagnetic energy and a planetary effect that you talked about before. But I was having a discussion with my other half, and I was explaining that the birds start singing at that time of the morning, like 4 a.m., 5 a.m., because it's the biggest, most significant change in the Earth's magnetic field, and it switches on the magnetite in the brains of the birds, and that's how they all fly north-south with this magnetite. And I often wake up at about that time. If I haven't been sleeping, or if I have been sleeping, I'll wake up at about 4 a.m. It's like at 3:37 a.m. I always wake up. in the summertime, because that's when the magnetic field's coming online. And I have these, it's just like somebody has just turned on the light in my head, and I wake up and I have these epiphanies. I have these moments of clarity, and perhaps maybe my memory gets switched on and activated then, Gerald. I'm totally open to the whole thing. I think that's maybe a lot of people will be aware of that. They call it the eureka moment when, you wake up in the middle of the night because of the magnetic field's changing and it's coming back online as the sun's rising.
That could be totally true. That could totally be true. Hey, I wanted to share a little bit more with you from this section on the composition of man. I was just looking through the book here to remind myself what I said, and something interesting jumped out at me. This is on page 98, by the way, for
Sure.
one of the editions of my book. Okay, this is the first one. It says, mastering the elements allows the secret of life in the body, and I put in parentheses, Ba, and I want to talk about that, to be activated, enabling one to choose to relinquish the body only when the mission is accomplished on Earth. So in other words, the implication is from the Emerald Tablets is, if you energetically get your antenna awake and your chakras aligned and achieve equation 5A to the best you can, and your pineal gland starts firing and you have the wings of Hermes experience, guess what? He's telling you, you have the ability at that point, your Ba energy, and he differentiates between the Ka and the Ba, and I think we're going to talk about that later.
Yeah, let's go into
it shows all through the Emerald Tablets, but this is another representation of the human energy body, okay? That says it can be activated. Well, what my experience pragmatically is, and most structural integrators will not tell you this, or they can't say things without making health claims, okay? There's a lot of hidden stuff that goes on in the structure community relative to energy and matter that never gets talked about outside of that community. So I hope I'm not stepping on any toes. But the reality is, in my experience, if somebody did even a first series structural integration session with me, and it's usually done in 5 weeks, 2 sessions a week, okay, to do the first recipe that everybody does before you get to the more advanced stuff, okay? And advanced to one person's not the same as advanced to others, okay? So everybody tries to come up with their recipes to put their arms around this profound process, but the reality is it's all about gravity. Anyway, so this statement he makes here, that if you activate your energy in your body, that basically you become eternal, and you can choose to get rid of your avatar body and take on another one whenever you want. Well, this is how he operated all through the Emerald Tablets and all his incarnations that he talks about, okay, was this knowledge, this secret knowledge to distinguish between energy and matter as it relates to you, not in CERN, not out in space, in your temple. It's so important. So I really cued in on this because, like I said, pragmatically, this became so important to me because it was changing my consciousness. It wasn't just an equation. It was really happening to me.
Sure.
And I was willing to play the gravity game to make this go to the maximal extent it could because I had that knowledge. Okay, and I try to share that with everyone. Anyway, once we got past this first composition of man, the second one he posits in the Emerald Tablets is this astral energy. And I find this really interesting as related to some of the stuff we'll talk about in my experience having out-of-body experiences. This astral energy, he says, has three elements. Okay, it's a mediator between the above and the below. Well, that's interesting. So what's above and below? Well, we'll talk about the idea of us living in a holographic simulator that has a clamp. There is a door. Yep. that differentiates between the above and below. And it turns out that's kind of analogous to what we knew about the Van Allen belts, which we just had a new discovery on. So that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. So this mediator between above and below. So in people that are familiar with out-of-body experiences, I think they would understand that. Non-spiritual. And this is interesting to me to differentiate between spirit and energy. And I oftentimes use those terms interchangeably, and sometimes I get rebuked for it. But in my mind, I think I'm still mostly correct. Now, the special nature of the energy never gets discussed about, well, what's this energy on this frequency versus that one? So you can say, spirit, but to me, when I hear that, I always hear energy. and maybe because I'm an electrical engineer, I don't know, but I have not had anybody dissuade me from still thinking that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would be the same. I would interchange them as well, depending on the day, depending on the day in question.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So in this non-spiritual, I introduced the idea of this Merkaba meditation that came from Drunvalo's teachings. Well, this meditation is ancient, and it contains two words, the ka and the ba. Well, it turns out those two words show up all through the Emerald Tablets. One represents the illusionary energy of transient matter that mankind signs up to and runs down on Black Friday to get as much as they can from Walmart, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's that's the illusion of ka, this transient matter illusion that keeps people enslaved. And when this activation energy that was talked about, and the secret, when you master the elements, what are the elements that we have to master? I'll tell you the one that's beating you on the head that you're ignoring is gravity. Sure. Don't ignore that one. If you master that one, guess what? It's got magic all of its own. And I want to say one more thing about that I didn't feel like I fully put a fork in it. When you stir up the body using those 4 principles, make it malleable so that the sticks and rubber bands can get loose and line to the gravity field, guess what happens? Not only do your chakras light up like an evolutionary freight train, but that process that you trigger and the malleability of that body, if you keep doing yoga and paying attention to where your bowling ball size head is on top of your shoulders, is your ear right over your shoulder, you're letting it fall forward. If you just play the game and pretend like gravity matters, guess what will happen? Your body will continue to adapt to it the rest of your life. Little distinguishments, up and down. It's amazing. Every day you get up, there's something different because you've been out of the gravity field, like you said, with magnetism, with the sun coming up. Well, it's the same with gravity. You stay out of the field overnight where you're sleeping, stand back up in it. Well, guess what? Now your whole broom pole gets an opportunity to be vertical in that field once again, right? And all the rubber bands and popsicle sticks are going to adjust to whatever pattern that you had that you thought was in proper relation to that. Some people think of it as their posture, okay? And it's a vanity thing, but it's not. Okay.
Can you get into some the Merkaba meditation, Gerald? Can you talk about that? The 17 breaths.
Sure. Yeah. And it's been around for a while. And I think Drunvalo and others who have done the recording of the meditation did a great job. So I don't want to step on any toes, and it's all their material, but it's been around a long time, and it's affiliated with the Flower of Life symbol that he discloses got him involved in this in the first place. Mm-hmm. That symbol relationally shows lots of processes that are circular, kind of like the Aurora Borealis, from a cellular level, from a seed to a plant to a fruit to a seed, and in circular rejuvenation process. Okay, that's what the Flower of Life represents. Well, when you find out that Thoth was all about this process and teaching in his mystery schools, it makes a lot more sense. So we want to talk about the Merkaba real quick. So in that process of activating various energy fields in your body, there's a meditation that allows you to do that, and it's called the Merkaba, and it's only 17 or 18 breaths, depending on the last breath or where you are in your process. Okay. So, generally, let's talk about what it is and how it works, and and why it works, and then we can probably go through and segment it if you want. I memorized it because I've done it so many times. Okay,
sure.
And so the idea is that the Merkaba field is a star tetrahedron type structure, and you can look up what a star tetrahedron is. It's kind of like a 3-dimensional pyramid going up and one going down, and they overlap each other.
Sure.
Okay. So it's like a triangle going up and a triangle coming down. It makes that 6-pointed star you see on the Israeli flag. Well, imagine that's 3-dimensional, and you do that.
It's like a 3-dimensional Israeli flag symbol. Yeah.
Right.
I got you.
Well, what's interesting to me is that structure shows up in a new field of study, and I think Richard Hoagland discussed it in his book, Dark History of NASA. I think I might have got the.
I think
title
Nassim
wrong.
Haramein.
Anyway, there's an idea of a spinning planet that has an equator, and that certain torsional effects show up based on how it's rotating, taking account angular momentum and the density of the planet.
I think
and
the
all
best
kinds
example of that,
composition.
Gerald, is Jupiter's spot occurs at the 19.5 degree star tetrahedron.
Exactly. So right at the 19.5 location is where one of the planes of the star tetrahedron crosses, and they realize the energy that's coming out of the poles of these planets is forming various geometries, depending on whether you're on the north or south side of how it's rotating. And this came out well.
The hexagon,
one of them, kind of makes a CSI on the bottom, and the top it makes a pentagon.
Yeah, there's a hexagon on Saturn.
Pentagon.
Saturn's the probably best example, I think, but there's a hexagon.
Yeah. So anyway, the idea that this is going on in planets, and thinking about as above, so below, as we're taught in the Merkaba, that energy that represents the planet is the same energy that's in a microcosm, in the same shape in your body, okay? So when I talk about the twin flames coming together, think about the top pyramid that's pointing down represents the male energy, and the one from the bottom going up represents the female, okay? Well, when those two join together, it creates the archetype of the Magus card, which is in the Tarot teaching, and it turns out to be none other than Thoth, who was represented as a hermaphrodite. He had both male and female energy. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this male and female energy are represented by these star tetrahedrons. If you go through this meditation, essentially what you're attempting to do, without walking through it, is visualize your energy relative to this male and female energy. There's a little bit of a clearing process. You play with your breath just slightly. It's nothing major. And then about the 14th breath, you prepare yourself and you activate visualizing this spinning Merkaba field, just like it would be, as the torsion field effect physics show, it happens in planets. So you visualize this process, and essentially through this meditation, you activate your Ba field. And this is the key field that Thoth talks about, and we don't want to get too far ahead, that's essentially break the illusion of Ka. Once you activate that field in your body, you're not going to be caught up in the desires of materialism anymore, because you're going to be focused on more permanent things by design. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, this whole idea of being caught up in this illusion of Ka has some deep legs from the electromagnetic spectrum standpoint. Thinking about our design, how they designed us to interact with the electromagnetic spectrum, and the theory is put forward by Drumvallo, as he was told by Thoth, he in his book, that there is a false Merkaba field that was set up to keep humans in their enslavement state. Wow. Okay, so all of a sudden you realize, it's not just the fluoride and all the other things to shut the pineal gland down, but it's that we're dealing with electromagnetic beatdown that is quite serious, that is designed to keep you from waking up.
These are some serious control mechanisms in place for us noisy humans, Gerald.
Yeah. They are noisy. So anyway, the 17th breath meditation. I used to do it every 24 hours until I felt like this field wasn't going to turn off and go away anymore. And I find that once you do that after some period of weeks, all of a sudden it's on, and that's it. It does make you very sensitive to other people's energy, though. Mm-hmm. This Merkaba field, according to Drumvallo, and I haven't physically measured it as a scientist, he says it extends out about 55 feet from your body either way. So now think about that. You just activate that. You go walk down the grocery store aisle with
55 feet?
Just random humans and see what you experience. It makes you feel like an alien. Okay.
Wow, that's incredible, Gerald. 55 feet.
55 feet. Now, this Ba is very, very important, and I'm just going to go ahead and put it out now, since we're going to be sneaking up on Chapter 5 pretty quick. This Ba field is our birthright that's been occluded from us. This energy, when you activate it, connects you back to what's called the Sun Soul. Mm. This is the derivation energy, a little piece of it from the Creator of all, that Enki made sure we had an access to by giving us our electromagnetic interface. And Ningshita gave us with our latent circuits so that we would wake up to that, even in the beatdown that's going on, by encoding it secretly in our DNA. And I think we talked about that last time. We kind of got ahead of ourselves on the 8 latent circuits that Timothy Leary introduced.
Yeah.
But anyway, so and then the other, we got to get back onto the three aspects of the composition of man. The other one under astral was the non-physical, and this is the ability to move above and below on Earth, which is what we term an out-of-body experience. And later in this chapter, I talk about the steps to achieve that, if for those that are interested, and the wonderful work done by Robert Monroe that saved my life as a 17-year-old when I was having out-of-body experiences and did not know what was happening to me.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
yeah. So this non-physical, so we've got the astral that has the mediator between the above and below, the non-spiritual, which I believe has to do with the Merkaba field that we talk about, and then the non-physical, and that's this silver thread that connects you from body to your energy body as you're out cruising around the simulator. Okay, and then the third one is this mental aspect, and there were three natures of that, and these are quite interesting to me. It's quite short. I'll just name them. A was the carrier of the will of the Great One. That's what so the mind has a component that has a aspect to it that is designed to carry out the will of the Creator of all. And when you activate your Ba field, I believe that this energy template that specifies what you're supposed to be in the physical form, and we can talk about that, I hope, how light creates matter. Okay, all matter, that this template that specifies what your physical form should look like, when the physical form begins to malleably adapt to that through structure work, all of a sudden, I think the higher self and the actual self become one, and you get a very profound mission. And that's been my experience watching people. When you wake up, you don't get to wake up and go get in a hammock. If you wake up in the simulator with the Ba energy and the kind of stuff we're talking about here, generally you get tagged to serve humanity, and when you realize what's going on, you do it willingly.
You know, the makeup of the human body that we're talking about, the physical, the astral, the mental, and all the different components that we've been talking about, Gerald, and to be designed by the Anunnaki, and then all these different elements to be controlled and tweaked and made, either shutting down some aspects and making some others still work and just enough. And it's so sophisticated, Gerald, what the Anunnaki have done with this worker, this replacement worker.
Well, that's one thing I discovered in studying anatomy and physiology. And as an electrical engineer, I didn't have a lot of knowledge about the body other than just what an athlete knows. I'm going to do back and buys this week when I work out, and chest and tris that week, and then I'm going to do my legs, just really, that's about, and then I got hamstrings and some quads and pecs and buys, that's about the limit of my physical knowledge. I knew that if I did stuff to it, it would change, but I didn't understand, from a energy standpoint, what I was doing. Anyway, so on this mental aspect, I think that's very interesting. The carrier of the will of the Great One. Now, all of a sudden, you got this Ba element that you activate that's a slice of the energy of the Great One, the creator of all. And now you realize your mind also has a carrier of the will of the Great One. Well, guess what? When that starts happening and your energy starts changing, you start operating more in accordance with the principles that are more in line with a immortal soul than someone who's caught up in an illusion of getting more matter, like a rat in a simulator. Okay. Item B for the mental was arbiter of cause. So everything that happens in your life, you're the arbiter of that. You caused it. And the third item is the arbiter of effect. Now, when it happens to you, you get to respond how you respond to it, because that's 90% of life. There's 10% of what happens to you, and 90% of how much you allow it to affect you, or what you're going to do to transmute what happened to you. Are you going to try to turn that darkness into light? All of a sudden, you're put into this place where you have to be the arbiter of effect. Okay, so these are very profound teachings that come from a document, which we're going to get into, about its historical legacy and its connection to Atlantis. They're talking about, hey, here's a rule book about the composition of man. Wouldn't you like to know this before you have a child and decide what the rules of interacting with the physical world are, so you can have an optimal experience? That's what I'm saying here.
What are we made of today? Where are we coming from? What do we know about ourselves from this history of the Anunnaki and the legacy that's been left to us?
Well, it's interesting you asked that because this chapter that we're discussing, chapter 3 out of my new book, The Seventh Planet, is really a synthesis of my pragmatic experience where science hasn't really caught up with some of the exploratory realms and, I don't know, people who are playing with higher energy through auric fields, through meditations, things like that, versus, what we could measure. So I think both of those come out in this chapter, which is kind of the best we can do with where we're at least where I was at the time that I had this information. So when we talk about the composition of man, that's probably a topic that I started thinking about when I was 13 or 14, and I was in sports, right? So I was playing football, running track, and playing baseball, pretty typical sports. And I noticed that in competing on the field that there were certain athletes that were more inspired, more capable, more whatever than others, and they were the stars.
Without further delay, let's bring on today's guests. Hi, Gerald. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, James, my Irish brother. It's so good to be back, having a real dialogue with some real meat.
That it is, Gerald. This is a real dialogue, and we've done some pretty heavy-hitting shows, and I'm just glad that it's continuing. I even had a couple of discussions during the week with the show we do, and I don't normally get to do that, Gerald. And I had a couple of private dialogues with the show, and the response that I'm getting, and the information that we're talking about is just super fascinating because it's very current, it's very pertinent to where I want to go in life, what I want to explore, and a lot of people are into this, Gerald, because they don't just want to know about the history, they want to know what it means for them, they want to know what they can do with it. I mean, if we were genetically altered as a slave species, was that a good thing? Was that a bad thing? If that was the case, Gerald, well then, where does that leave us today? Are we going to evolve, or were we permanently just, made with defects? And all these questions are abound now, Gerald. All these questions are abound, and that's what we're getting into, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that process you're describing where someone finds out the truth about their origins, and there's a deconstruction process that kind of goes along with that they have to start from the past, corroborate, and then they start fast forwarding to their lives and how it affects them here and now. And it usually takes some time, but and it's a process I've watched since I've been in this realm for several years now. I started researching this stuff in 2003 or 2004, and I was one of those kind of sideline observers, even though I was staying fully engaged in my research, but I couldn't really talk about the stuff and still continue the lifestyle that I was in, especially as an engineer. So, it was still goofy information where people didn't even talk about UFOs that much. Ours, right? And so, being any typical kid is like, well, it's like looking at an animal that has a capability that you don't have. Go, well, what do I have to do to be able to operate that way? So I started looking at people on the chessboard of life more in terms of these entities that had certain energy, and usually where there was this bigger than life energy, there was a being who had, yes, a big ego, but oftentimes just an auric field that was overwhelming. They'd light up a room they walk in. And then I started thinking to myself about this: what is the place where energy and matter intersect, and how do we characterize this? And it was a question I was asking myself as a young athlete, and I never really quite got an answer, but that was still in the background of my mind when I was thinking about the composition of man. And this came to a head for me, this distinction between energy and matter, when I was just graduating from my structural integration training in Kauai that was taught by the Guild for Structural Integration based out of Boulder. And so I was doing the final two phases of my holistic healthcare practice training to become a structural integrator for my kid JJ. Really not to open a practice, but I just wanted this. It had started though. And then, in 2009 with the Ancient Aliens on History Channel coming out and starting to broach some of this material, it started becoming a little more discussable. So
sure, it's a journey of discovery.
In general, this process that somebody goes through when they're exposed to this, and some people have assigned, I don't know, labels to what they call it, and it's kind of telling. And some people call it breaking the God spell in a way because of what was done. So
it's a profound journey of discovery, Gerald, and you see it in people when they get the knowledge and they can't deny it anymore, and then they go, oh, and the awareness comes after that, and what it all means. It is a profound journey of discovery. I guess that's what leads us into the topics for today's show. I mean, last time we got into the Igigi, the miners, the awareness. Did they have awareness? Did they get triggered with mechanisms for ascension, or Ningishida, the geneticist, to fix the problem? These are all great questions and great explorations of the details of the legacy of what we've been left with this information. Let's get right into it, Gerald. And let's continue on that. What is the composition of man?